From the nonpartisan Maddy Institute and the California channel at the state capitol, this is a Maddy Policy Brief.
Welcome. The state auditor recently released a report on the foster care program and the shocking use of psychotropic medicines on foster youth. Elaine Howe, the state auditor, is with us here to talk about those findings. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Pleased to be here.
So people probably think they know all about the foster care system, but can you give us kind of an overview of California's foster care system?
Sure. The foster care system in California is essentially a social welfare system that's administered not only by the state of California, but federal government supports it, and certainly the local level counties. And the foster care system, kids enter that system through two different avenues. One may be through county welfare, where a child is taken out of the home because the parents just don't have the ability to properly care for that child. Some kids come through the juvenile system, where they become a ward of the court because they're getting into trouble and they're beyond the ability of the parent to take care of that child and discipline that child. So that child may come into the system and be placed in foster care because he or she's been getting in a lot of trouble.
Okay, so difficult situations are being addressed by the state. It sounds like there's a number of governmental agencies that have their hands in this. You have the federal government, the state government, the county, local level. Who's responsible for what? Who pays for what?
Right, there are. The federal government pays a fairly substantial share. It's between 50 and 75%, depending on the type of care that's provided to the child, whether it's healthcare services or administrative type services. There's a percentage of the cost that the federal government pays for. And then the state and local governments also chip in a certain amount of money, and recently realignment a few years ago pushed a lot of state taxes, vehicle fees, et cetera, down to the locals, and they use some of that money to support foster care kids.
Okay, and realignment was Governor Brown's attempt to kind of push some of this stuff down to the local level, the thought being that locals could handle the situation better maybe than at the state level.
Exactly.
It seems like there's a lot of troubled kids in this system, I'm guessing. What is, are there more troubled kids in foster care, I assume they are, than the general population?
Well, there are a lot of kids in foster care in California. There's upwards of 80,000, I think it's 79 some odd thousand children in the foster care system. And clearly many of these kids are troubled for a variety of reasons. They are coming out of a traumatic situation. They've been taken out of their home, or they've gotten into trouble.
Physical abuse, sexual abuse?
Absolutely. It could be any type of abuse, neglect, etc. So these kids, have already gone through a traumatic situation and now are in the foster care system and as we're going to talk about today, being administered some very significant drugs.
Yeah, so some of them are prescribed medications. How many are being prescribed medications?
In California, it's about 12%, so over about 9,700 children that we found in the database that actually were receiving prescriptions for psychotropic medications, which are antipsychotics, antidepressants, in some cases stimulants, very powerful
It sounds like pretty powerful stuff.
Right, very powerful medications.
And how does that compare to the general population? It's quite a bit lower in the general population?
Typically, it's much lower in the general population. We looked at some studies, and California, as I said, about 12% of the foster kids are on these types of medications. In the general population, it ranges between 5 and 10%, depending on which study you look at.
So you could be as many as twice as many of these kids are on medications than the typical normal population.
Yes, that's
and
correct.
People already talk about, these days about people over-prescribe medications for kids as opposed to what they were doing 20, 30, 40 years ago. So I assume there are some kind of standards for the safe and appropriate use of these psychotropic medicines on foster children. If so, who sets that standard? Is that a federal standard, a state standard, a local? Is it, a psychological association? Who sets the standards?
Well, there actually are state guidelines. It's not necessarily set in state law, but there are guidelines that the state of California has put together, the Department of Social Services, Health Services, and when they put those guidelines together, they looked at the Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry and some other experts out there who have best practices, and they put together some best practices and their guidance for counties to follow.
So it's not a requirement?
Not necessarily a requirement.
I'm wondering if there's legal liability. It's a guidance, but if you don't follow it, I suppose you expose yourself to more legal liability. That's a separate question. But so there are guidelines that the state's adopted. And can you give me some examples? I think you were talking on your report about, for example, follow-up 1 month after a child receives medication to see how the medication's working. Those are the kind of guidelines we're talking about?
Right. That's one type of guideline where a child is prescribed a certain medication, and ideally it should be within 2 weeks, but at a maximum 30 days. And what we found is some kids weren't being seen for months. But that's one example of guidance.
Okay. Well, I was wondering, there were some other things you also talked about, and also the total number of meds given to children. Obviously, the younger the child, I would assume, the lower the dosage probably should be, correct?
Right. The guidance that was put out does split it up by age group. So, for example, a child between 0, an infant, and 5 years old should be only receiving one medication, and then it goes up as the child is
It's
older.
hard to believe that someone would actually give them more than one medication when they're only 0 to 5 years old. But
Right.
well, thank you for explaining the psychotropic meds used in the foster care system.
For a more